In the blazing heat of a Pacific morning on June 19, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Alex Vrasiu pressed his thumb against the trigger of his F6F Hellcat. Below him, stretched across the endless blue of the Philippine Sea, Japanese Zero fighters twisted and turned in desperate evasion maneuvers. What happened next would become one of the most lopsided aerial battles in aviation history. In just 8 minutes, Vrasiu shot down 6 enemy aircraft. But this wasn't luck. This was the result of American engineering that had fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the Pacific sky. For 3 years, Japanese pilots had dominated the air with their legendary Zero fighter. Fast, maneuverable, and flown by some of the most skilled aviators in the world, the Zero had carved through Allied defences like a sword through silk. American pilots called encounters with Zeros a death sentence. But by 1943, something had changed. A new predator had emerged from the factories of Grumman aircraft, and suddenly it was Japanese pilots sending frantic radio transmissions about a fighter they couldn't outrun, couldn't outgun, and couldn't escape. What you're about to discover isn't just the story of 2 aircraft. It's the tale of how American industrial might and tactical innovation turned the most feared fighter in the Pacific into prey. By the time this video ends, you'll understand exactly why Japanese commanders began pulling their best pilots from combat, why Zero production couldn't keep pace with losses, and how a single American fighter design changed the entire course of the Pacific War. But first, let me take you back to December 7th, 1941, when the world first witnessed what Japanese aviation could accomplish. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a surprise attack. It was a devastating demonstration of Japanese air power that sent shockwaves through every Allied military command. Leading that assault were 420 aircraft, and at the tip of the spear flew the Mitsubishi A6M0. As American sailors watched in horror, these sleek fighters dove through anti-aircraft fire that should have shredded them. Yet they emerged unscathed to strafe airfields and shipping with deadly precision. The Zero's reputation had been forged years earlier over the skies of China, where it achieved kill ratios that seemed impossible. Japanese pilots reported shooting down 12 Chinese aircraft for every Zero lost. American military observers initially dismissed these claims as propaganda. They were wrong. The Zero possessed a combination of speed, range, and maneuverability that no Allied fighter could match. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces, described the Zero as an extension of his own body. The aircraft responded to the slightest touch, could turn inside any opponent, and possessed the range to escort bombers on missions that stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean. When American P-40 Warhawks first tangled with Zeros over the Philippines, the results were catastrophic. Experienced American pilots found themselves completely outclassed by an enemy fighter that could outmaneuver them at will. But the Zero's dominance came with a hidden cost. To achieve its incredible performance, Japanese designers had made compromises that would eventually prove fatal. The aircraft carried no armor protection for the pilot. Its fuel tanks were unprotected by self-sealing materials. Every ounce of weight had been sacrificed for speed and agility. In the early war period, when Japanese pilots were superbly trained veterans with hundreds of flight hours, these trade-offs seemed acceptable. The Zero's agility meant enemy bullets rarely found their mark. Yet even as Zero pilots celebrated their victories across the Pacific, American engineers were studying every scrap of intelligence about the mysterious Japanese fighter. At Wright Field in Ohio, captured fragments were analysed. Pilot debriefs were scrutinised. Performance estimates were calculated and recalculated. The Americans were learning, and what they discovered would reshape their entire approach to fighter design. The breakthrough came in June 1942, when Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga's Zero crash-landed on Akutan Island after taking damage during the attack on Dutch Harbour. The aircraft was recovered nearly intact by American forces, providing the first complete example of Japan's premier fighter. What engineers found when they examined the Zero piece by piece was both impressive and deeply flawed. The Zero was indeed a remarkable aircraft. Its lightweight construction and powerful engine gave it performance that exceeded most American fighters of the period. But those same weight-saving measures that made it so agile also made it incredibly vulnerable. A few well-placed bullets could set the entire aircraft ablaze. The lack of pilot protection meant that even minor hits could prove fatal. Most critically, the Zero's performance fell off dramatically at high altitudes and high speeds. Armed with this intelligence, American designers began crafting a response. The aircraft that emerged from their drawing boards would be everything the Zero was not. Heavy instead of light. Armoured instead of fragile. Built to absorb punishment rather than avoid it entirely. The Grumman F6F Hellcat was designed from the ground up as a Zero killer, and every aspect of its design reflected lessons learned from 3 years of bitter combat. When the first Hellcat prototype took to the skies in June 1942, it represented a fundamentally different philosophy of fighter design. Where the Zero sacrificed everything for agility, the Hellcat was built around the principle of survivability. Thick armor plating protected the pilot from behind and below. Self-sealing fuel tanks could absorb multiple hits without exploding. The entire airframe was designed to bring damaged aircraft and wounded pilots home. But the Hellcat wasn't just a flying tank. Powered by the massive Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine producing over 2,000 horsepower, it possessed raw power that the Zero simply couldn't match. At high altitude, where many Pacific battles were fought, the Hellcat's performance actually improved, while the Zeros fell off dramatically. American pilots soon learned that they didn't need to turn fight with Zeros. They could use superior speed and power to dictate the terms of engagement. The armament difference was equally decisive. While the Zero carried two 20mm cannons and 2 rifle-caliber machine guns, the Hellcat bristled with 6.50 caliber machine guns that fired at a combined rate of 4,800 rounds per minute. When a Hellcat's guns found their target, the results were devastating. The heavy slugs could tear through the Zero's unarmored structure, often causing catastrophic damage with just a few hits. Production numbers tell their own story about American industrial capacity. While Japan struggled to build Zeros fast enough to replace combat losses, Grumman factories were rolling out Hellcats at an unprecedented pace. By 1943, new Hellcats were reaching Pacific squadrons faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. The production line that had started with a handful of prototypes would eventually deliver over 12,000 aircraft before the war's end. Yet numbers alone don't explain the Hellcat's dominance. The real secret lay in how American tactics evolved to maximize the new fighter strengths while exploiting the Zero's weaknesses. Squadron commanders developed the maneuver that allowed Pearsach weave, a defensive T-ace of Hellcats, to protect each other during engagements. The boom and zoom technique enabled American pilots to use their superior speed and power to attack Zeros from above, then escape before the more maneuverable Japanese fighters could respond. Training played an equally crucial role. While Japan's pilot training program was being shortened due to fuel shortages and the urgent need for replacements, American flight schools were expanding rapidly. New Hellcat pilots arrived in the Pacific with hundreds of hours of flight time and extensive gunnery training. They understood their aircraft's capabilities and limitations intimately. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. Veterans who had dominated the skies for 3 years suddenly found themselves facing an opponent they couldn't defeat through superior flying skills alone. Radio intercepts from Japanese formations revealed growing desperation as pilots reported being unable to escape or outfight the new American fighters. Lieutenant Commander Vrasiu's 8-minute massacre over the Philippine Sea wasn't an isolated incident. Across the Pacific, similar scenes were playing out as Hellcat squadrons encountered Zero formations. The kill ratios that had once favoured Japan were not just reversed, but completely inverted. Where Japanese pilots had once achieved 12-to-1 advantages, American Hellcat pilots were routinely scoring similar ratios in their favor. By early 1944, Japanese commanders faced a stark reality. Their most experienced pilots were being shot down faster than replacements could be trained. Aircraft production was falling behind losses. The Zero, once the symbol of Japanese air superiority, had become a liability in the face of American industrial might and tactical innovation. The stage was set for the largest carrier battle in history, where the true extent of the Hellcat's dominance would be revealed in what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The morning of June 19, 1944, dawned with deceptive calm over the Philippine Sea. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet had spent weeks preparing for this moment, assembling the largest carrier force Japan had fielded since Midway. 9 aircraft carriers loaded with over 400 planes represented the last hope of Japanese naval aviation. Their mission was simple in concept, but desperate in execution: destroy the American invasion fleet threatening the Mariana Islands and restore Japanese control of the Pacific sky. What Ozawa didn't know was that his carefully planned ambush was about to collide with the most lethal concentration of American naval aviation ever assembled. Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Mark Mitcher, deployed 15 aircraft carriers bristling with nearly 1,000 aircraft. At the heart of this armada flew 450 F6F Hellcats, their pilots eager to test 3 years of tactical development against Japan's remaining elite aviators. The first wave of Japanese aircraft launched at dawn, climbing steadily toward their maximum operational altitude. Leading the formation were 69 Zeros, their pilots representing the cream of what remained of Japanese naval aviation. Many had survived the brutal attrition of Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. They understood they were flying against overwhelming odds, but Japanese doctrine demanded they press forward regardless of cost. Lieutenant Hiromu Takahashi gripped his Zero's controls as his formation approached the American fleet's defensive perimeter. Below him stretched an ocean dotted with more ships than he had ever seen in a single formation. The sight should have been intimidating, but Takahashi had trained for this moment his entire career. His Zero responded to every input with the precision that had made Japanese fighters legendary. Yet something felt different about this mission. American radar had detected his formation while still 150 miles away, and defensive fighters were already climbing to intercept. The first Hellcats appeared as distant specks against the morning sky, but they multiplied rapidly as more squadrons joined the defensive screen. Commander David McCampbell, leading Fighting Squadron 15, studied the approaching Japanese formation through his gun sight. The tactical situation was exactly what American pilots had trained for: superior numbers, altitude advantage, and aircraft designed specifically to exploit Zero vulnerabilities. McCampbell's radio crackled with coordinated calls as Hellcat squadrons positioned themselves for maximum effectiveness. The thatch-weave formations that had been developed through bitter experience over Guadalcanal were now second nature to American pilots. Each pair of fighters could protect the other while maintaining offensive capability. The Japanese, flying in loose formations optimized for individual dogfighting prowess, were about to discover how deadly coordinated teamwork could be. The engagement began with a thunderous roar as 6.50 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously from multiple Hellcats. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Japanese pilots who had grown accustomed to the lighter armament of earlier American fighters suddenly found themselves facing a wall of heavy machine gun fire that could shred their unarmored aircraft with terrifying efficiency. Takahashi watched in horror as the Zero flying off his wing disintegrated under a burst of Hellcat fire. The heavy slugs tore through the lightweight aluminum structure, igniting fuel and hydraulic lines in a cascade of destruction. Within seconds, a fighter that had taken months to build and years to master was reduced to burning wreckage plummeting toward the ocean below. The speed differential became apparent immediately. When Takahashi attempted to engage a Hellcat in the turning fight that had served Zero pilots so well throughout the early war, his target simply accelerated away using superior engine power. The American pilot climbed rapidly, gained altitude advantage, then dove back into the engagement with devastating speed. This boom and zoom tactic neutralized the Zero's maneuverability advantage while maximizing the Hellcat's strengths. Radio communications between Japanese pilots revealed growing panic as traditional tactics proved useless. Veteran aviators who had dominated Pacific skies found themselves unable to escape or effectively counterattack. The Hellcat's armor protection meant that even accurate Zero fire often failed to achieve decisive results, while any hits scored by American pilots frequently proved catastrophic to the lightweight Japanese fighters. Lieutenant Commander Alex Vrasiu, already an ace with multiple Zero kills to his credit, demonstrated the lethal efficiency that proper training and superior equipment could achieve. His methodical approach to aerial combat reflected the systematic way American aviation had evolved since Pearl Harbor. Each engagement was calculated, using predetermined tactics that maximized his aircraft's advantages while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. The Japanese formation began to disintegrate as individual pilots found themselves isolated and overwhelmed. The coordinated defensive screen that American carriers had deployed created multiple layers of Hellcat interceptors, each positioned to catch Japanese aircraft that managed to penetrate the outer defenses. Even if a Zero pilot successfully evaded the first group of defenders, fresh Hellcats were climbing to engage from below, while others dove from superior altitude. The fuel situation added another layer of desperation to the Japanese attack. Unlike the early war period, when Zeros could loiter over target areas for extended periods, the long range required to reach the American fleet meant that Japanese pilots had limited time over target before being forced to return to their carriers. Every minute spent in defensive maneuvering was a minute less available for the actual attack mission. American pilots, operating much closer to their own carriers, faced no such constraints. Damaged Hellcats could return to friendly decks for repair and rearmament, while their pilots received immediate medical attention if wounded. The industrial capacity that had produced over 12,000 Hellcats also generated spare parts, ammunition, and fuel in quantities that Japanese logistics could no longer match. The psychological toll on surviving Japanese pilots was severe and immediate. Veterans who had entered the battle with confidence based on years of aerial victories found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about air combat. The Zero's legendary maneuverability, which had once guaranteed survival against less capable opponents, now seemed inadequate against pilots flying superior aircraft and employing tactics specifically designed to counter Japanese advantages. Commander McCampbell's squadron alone accounted for 37 Japanese aircraft destroyed during the morning engagement, with no American losses. The kill ratio that emerged from detailed post-battle analysis revealed the true extent of American tactical and technological superiority. Where early war encounters had favoured Japanese pilots by margins of 10 or 12 to 1, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot produced ratios exceeding 20 to 1 in favour of American forces. The second and third waves of Japanese attacks fared no better than the first. Each successive formation faced increasingly confident American defenders who had refined their tactics through actual combat experience gained just hours earlier. Hellcat pilots, who had scored their first victories during the morning engagement, were already incorporating lessons learned into afternoon battles. Japanese carrier commanders monitoring radio communications from their attacking aircraft grew increasingly desperate as reports filtered back describing wholesale slaughter of their carefully hoarded air groups. The elite pilots who represented years of training and irreplaceable combat experience were being systematically destroyed by an enemy they could neither outfight nor escape. By midday, the mathematical reality of the situation had become undeniable. Japan's carefully planned counteroffensive was collapsing under the weight of American technological and tactical superiority. The Hellcat had not merely defeated the Zero, it had rendered Japanese naval aviation tactically obsolete. The implications extended far beyond a single day's battle. The pilot losses sustained during the Great Marianas Turkey shoot represented a catastrophic blow to Japanese aviation from which recovery would prove impossible. The training infrastructure that had once produced world-class aviators was already strained beyond capacity by fuel shortages and industrial limitations. Replacing hundreds of experienced pilots lost in a single engagement was simply beyond Japanese capabilities. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly as Admiral Ozawa faced the grim reality filtering through his radio communications. His carefully orchestrated offensive, planned for months and representing Japan's last substantial carrier force, was disintegrating before his eyes. The reports streaming in from surviving pilots painted a picture so catastrophic that even veteran commanders struggled to comprehend its implications. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, one of the few Zero pilots to survive the morning slaughter, transmitted a desperate assessment that would haunt Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the war. His voice, strained by exhaustion and terror, crackled through the static as he described American fighters that seemed invulnerable to traditional Japanese tactics. The Hellcats absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any aircraft in the Japanese inventory, while their concentrated firepower reduced Zeros to burning wreckage with horrifying efficiency. What made the situation even more desperate was the quality of pilots being lost. These weren't inexperienced recruits fresh from abbreviated training programs. The formations that had launched that morning contained Japan's most skilled aviators, men with hundreds of combat hours who had survived the brutal attrition of 3 years of Pacific warfare. Each pilot shot down represented an irreplaceable asset that Japanese training schools could no longer produce. The industrial mathematics were equally devastating. While American factories continued rolling out new Hellcats at a rate that exceeded combat losses by enormous margins, Japanese aircraft production was struggling to maintain even basic replacement levels. The Zero production lines that had once seemed adequate were now revealed as woefully insufficient for the scale of warfare that American industrial capacity had made possible. Fuel shortages compounded every other problem facing Japanese aviation. The petroleum reserves that had once supported extensive pilot training programs were now so depleted that new aviators received barely enough flight time to master basic aircraft handling, let alone the complex tactical maneuvering required for aerial combat. American pilots, by contrast, arrived in Pacific squadrons with hundreds of hours of flight experience and extensive gunnery training that had been conducted without regard for fuel conservation. The technological gap had widened beyond any possibility of Japanese recovery. While Zero development had essentially stagnated since 1940, American aircraft design had undergone continuous evolution driven by combat experience and unlimited research funding. The Hellcat represented the culmination of systematic analysis of every aerial engagement since Pearl Harbor, incorporating lessons learned from thousands of individual combat reports. Engine technology illustrated this disparity perfectly. The Pratt and Whitney R2800 double wasp powering the Hellcat produced over 2,000 horsepower from an engine that was both reliable and maintainable under combat conditions. Japanese engineers, lacking access to the advanced metallurgy and precision manufacturing that made such power levels possible, were forced to extract maximum performance from fundamentally less capable power plants. The radar revolution had transformed aerial warfare in ways that Japanese commanders were only beginning to understand. American carriers could detect incoming raids while still 200 miles away, providing defenders with crucial time to position interceptors at optimal altitudes and vectors. Japanese pilots, accustomed to achieving surprise through careful navigation and timing, now found themselves flying into prepared defenses that had been tracking their approach for hours. Communication systems provided another decisive advantage to American forces. Hellcat pilots coordinated their attacks through clear radio channels that allowed real-time tactical adjustments as combat situations developed. Japanese formations, operating with inferior radio equipment and communication protocols, often found individual pilots isolated and unable to coordinate mutual support when American attacks began. The training revolution that had transformed American naval aviation was perhaps the most significant factor in the Hellcat's dominance. Standardized tactics developed through systematic analysis of combat reports meant that every American pilot understood exactly how to exploit Hellcat advantages while avoiding zero strengths. This institutional knowledge, disseminated through comprehensive training programs, turned individual aircraft superiority into overwhelming tactical dominance. Lieutenant Commander Vrasiu's methodical destruction of 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes exemplified this systematic approach to aerial combat. His attacks followed predetermined patterns that maximized hit probability while minimizing exposure to return fire. Each engagement built upon lessons learned from previous encounters, creating a feedback loop that continuously improved American tactical effectiveness. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots extended far beyond individual battles. Veterans who had dominated Pacific skies for 3 years found themselves facing an enemy they could neither outfight nor escape. The confidence that had once made Japanese aviators so formidable was being systematically destroyed through repeated encounters with superior American equipment and tactics. Radio intercepts revealed the growing desperation among Japanese formations as pilots reported their inability to achieve effective attacks against American shipping. The defensive screens of Hellcats proved impenetrable to aircraft that had once penetrated Allied defenses with relative ease. Even when individual Zeros managed to reach attack positions, their light armament proved inadequate against increasingly well-protected American vessels. The logistics of sustained carrier operations highlighted another crucial American advantage. While Japanese carriers struggled with fuel shortages and limited spare parts inventories, American task forces operated with supply lines that seemed unlimited. Damaged Hellcats could be repaired or replaced without affecting operational tempo, while Japanese losses represented permanent reductions in combat capability. Admiral Mitchell's tactical deployment of his carrier forces demonstrated the strategic thinking that had transformed American naval aviation. Rather than concentrating his carriers in tight formations vulnerable to concentrated attack, he dispersed them in mutually supporting groups that created overlapping defensive zones. This deployment maximized the effectiveness of his Hellcat squadrons while minimizing vulnerability to the coordinated strikes that had once been Japan's specialty. The intelligence advantage possessed by American forces was equally decisive. Code-breaking operations had provided detailed information about Japanese battle plans, allowing defenders to position their forces optimally before attacks began. Japanese commanders, operating without similar intelligence capabilities, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by opponents who seemed to anticipate their every move. The medical and rescue capabilities that supported American operations created a crucial morale advantage. Hellcat pilots knew that survival of aircraft damage or water landings was highly likely due to comprehensive search and rescue operations. Japanese pilots faced the grim reality that any combat damage over the vast Pacific likely meant death, creating psychological pressure that affected performance in critical situations. By late afternoon on June 19th, the mathematical certainty of Japanese defeat had become undeniable. The air groups that had represented Japan's last hope of regaining air superiority were scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean, their remnants limping back to carriers that could no longer provide effective support. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had not merely been a tactical victory for American forces. It had permanently shifted the balance of Pacific air power in ways that would determine the war's ultimate outcome. The few Zero pilots who successfully returned to their carriers brought with them reports that shattered any remaining illusions about Japanese aviation capabilities. Their descriptions of Hellcat performance and American tactical coordination painted a picture of technological and tactical superiority so complete that continued resistance seemed futile. Yet Japanese military culture demanded that the fight continue, regardless of the hopelessness of the situation. The industrial implications of the day's losses would reverberate through Japanese military planning for the remainder of the war. The aircraft destroyed during the Turkey Shoot represented not just immediate tactical defeats, but strategic losses that could never be recovered. American production capacity had reached levels where battle damage was merely an inconvenience, while every Japanese loss brought their aviation forces closer to complete collapse. The pilot shortage that had already begun affecting Japanese operations would now become critical. The experienced aviators lost during the Marianas battle could not be replaced by the abbreviated training programs that fuel shortages had made necessary. Future Japanese air operations would be conducted increasingly by pilots whose limited experience made them easy targets for veteran American squadrons flying superior aircraft. The strategic ramifications extended far beyond individual pilot losses or aircraft statistics. Japanese naval doctrine had been built around the concept of decisive battle, where concentrated carrier strikes could achieve victory through superior pilot skill and tactical coordination. The Turkey shoot demonstrated that this entire strategic framework had become obsolete in the face of American industrial capacity and technological advancement. Emperor Hirohito himself would later receive briefings describing the catastrophic nature of the losses sustained during the Marianas operation. The reports painted a stark picture of Japanese aviation capabilities that had been reduced to a fraction of their former strength in a single day of combat. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was profound, though publicly they maintained that the war could still be won through superior fighting spirit. The technological revolution that had produced the Hellcat was accelerating rather than slowing down. American research facilities were already developing the next generation of carrier-based fighters that would make even the formidable F6F seem outdated. The F-4U Corsair was entering service in increasing numbers, while experimental aircraft pushed performance boundaries that Japanese designers could barely comprehend. Manufacturing capacity told an even more devastating story. The Grumman production lines that had delivered the Hellcat's dominating Pacific skies were operating at maximum efficiency, with new aircraft rolling off assembly lines every few hours. Japanese factories, meanwhile, struggled with material shortages, bombing raids, and the loss of skilled workers to military service. The gap between American and Japanese production capabilities was widening daily. Fuel allocation became increasingly critical for Japanese operations. The petroleum reserves that had once supported comprehensive pilot training programs were now so depleted that flight time for new aviators was measured in hours rather than the hundreds of flight hours that American pilots received. This training disparity created a vicious cycle where inexperienced Japanese pilots were even more vulnerable to veteran American squadrons. The radar technology that had given American defenders such decisive advantages was being continuously improved and refined. New systems could track individual aircraft at ranges exceeding 300 miles, providing fleet commanders with unprecedented situational awareness. Japanese forces, lacking equivalent technology, were fighting blind against opponents who could see everything. Lieutenant Commander McCampbell's squadron analysis revealed the systematic nature of American tactical development. Every engagement was studied, every successful maneuver documented and incorporated into training programs. This institutional learning process meant that American tactical effectiveness improved continuously, while Japanese aviation became increasingly predictable and vulnerable. The communication networks supporting American carrier operations enabled real-time coordination between squadrons that Japanese commanders found almost impossible to counter. Hellcat formations could be vectored to optimal intercept positions while maintaining mutual support throughout extended engagements. Japanese pilots operating with inferior radio equipment often found themselves isolated and overwhelmed. Supply chain logistics demonstrated another crushing American advantage. Spare parts, ammunition, and maintenance supplies flowed to Pacific carriers in quantities that seemed limitless to Japanese observers. American mechanics could repair battle damage that would have grounded Japanese aircraft permanently, while replacement aircraft arrived faster than combat losses could accumulate. The training infrastructure supporting American aviation had evolved into a massive industrial enterprise. Flight schools across the United States were producing pilots faster than aircraft could be manufactured, creating a surplus of qualified aviators that allowed squadron commanders to select only the most capable candidates for combat assignments. Japanese training programs, constrained by fuel shortages and instructor losses, could barely maintain pilot numbers at sustainable levels. Medical advances had transformed the survival rates of American aircrew shot down over water. Improved life rafts, emergency beacons, and systematic search and rescue operations meant that aircraft loss didn't necessarily mean pilot loss. Japanese aviators faced the grim reality that any combat damage over the Pacific's vast expanses likely meant death, creating psychological pressure that affected performance in critical moments. The intelligence revolution that supported American operations extended far beyond code-breaking activities. Systematic analysis of captured Japanese equipment provided detailed information about aircraft capabilities and limitations that American tacticians exploited ruthlessly. Japanese forces, lacking equivalent intelligence capabilities, were consistently surprised by American technological developments and tactical innovations. Admiral Ozawa's desperate attempts to salvage something from the disaster led to increasingly reckless decisions that only compounded Japanese losses. The remaining aircraft, in his depleted air groups, were committed to attacks that had virtually no chance of success, throwing away the last remnants of Japanese naval aviation in futile gestures that accomplished nothing beyond hastening the inevitable defeat. The psychological warfare aspects of the Hellcat's dominance were as important as its technical capabilities. Japanese pilots, who had once approached combat with confidence based on aircraft superiority, now faced each engagement knowing they were flying inferior equipment against better-trained opponents. This mental burden affected decision-making in critical situations where split-second reactions determined survival. Production quality control in Japanese factories had deteriorated significantly due to material shortages and inexperienced workers. Aircraft that might once have met rigorous standards were now accepted with defects that compromised performance and reliability. American quality control, meanwhile, had become increasingly stringent as manufacturing experience accumulated and production techniques improved. The strategic bombing campaign against Japanese industrial targets was beginning to affect aircraft production in ways that would become increasingly severe. Factory dispersal efforts meant that component manufacturing was scattered across multiple sites, creating coordination problems that reduced overall efficiency. American production facilities, protected by ocean barriers and air defenses, operated without such constraints. Pilot replacement rates revealed the unsustainable nature of Japanese aviation losses. The training pipeline that had once produced world-class aviators was now delivering pilots with barely enough flight time to handle basic aircraft operations, let alone the complex maneuvering required for effective combat. American pilot training programs, meanwhile, were expanding to meet increasing demand for qualified aircrew. The maintenance crisis affecting Japanese aviation was reaching critical levels. Spare parts shortages meant that aircraft were being cannibalized to keep others operational, while American maintenance depots could repair battle damage that would have resulted in total aircraft loss for Japanese forces. This disparity in maintenance capabilities translated directly into operational aircraft availability. Weather reconnaissance and forecasting provided American forces with another significant advantage. Accurate meteorological information allowed mission planners to optimize timing and routing for maximum effectiveness, while Japanese operations were increasingly hampered by inadequate weather intelligence that led to missions being flown in adverse conditions. The naval architecture supporting American carrier operations had evolved to maximize aircraft handling efficiency. Improved catapult systems, arresting gear and flight deck procedures meant that American carriers could launch and recover aircraft faster than their Japanese counterparts, providing crucial advantages during extended operations. Training standardization across American naval aviation meant that pilots could transition between squadrons and aircraft types with minimal adaptation periods. Japanese pilots, trained on specific aircraft variants, often struggled when forced to fly different equipment due to losses and shortages. The industrial espionage network that had once provided Japanese designers with information about American aircraft development had been largely dismantled by security improvements and code-breaking successes. Japanese engineers were now working blind while American intelligence continued providing detailed information about Japanese capabilities and limitations. Fuel quality had become a critical factor affecting Japanese aircraft performance. Shortages of high-octane aviation gasoline meant that engines could not develop rated power, reducing aircraft performance significantly. American forces operated with unlimited supplies of the highest quality fuels available. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had not merely been a tactical victory. It represented the complete transformation of Pacific air warfare from a contest between roughly equal opponents to a systematic destruction of Japanese aviation capabilities by technologically superior American forces operating with unlimited industrial support. The numbers tell the final story with brutal clarity. By war's end, the F6F Hellcat had achieved a kill ratio of 19-1 against all Japanese aircraft types, with individual squadrons recording even more devastating statistics. Over 5,000 enemy aircraft fell to Hellcat guns, while fewer than 300 Hellcats were lost in air-to-air combat. These weren't just statistics on a page. They represented the systematic dismantling of what had once been the world's most formidable naval aviation force. The Zero that had terrorized Allied pilots for 3 years became a relic of an earlier era, outclassed by American engineering and overwhelmed by industrial capacity that Japan could never hope to match. Japanese pilots who had once dominated Pacific skies found themselves flying obsolete aircraft against opponents who possessed every conceivable advantage. The psychological transformation was complete. Where once American pilots had feared the Zero's legendary maneuverability, now Japanese aviators transmitted desperate warnings about fighters they described as unstoppable. The Hellcat's victory that wasn't just about superior firepower or better armour. Though those factors proved decisive, it represented the triumph of systematic analysis over traditional tactics, of industrial might over individual skill, and of technological innovation over established doctrine. American engineers had studied their enemy, identified weaknesses, and crafted a response so effective that it changed the fundamental nature of aerial warfare. When Lieutenant Commander Verosio destroyed 6 Zeros in 8 minutes over the Philippine Sea, he wasn't just demonstrating superior piloting skills. He was proving that the age of Japanese air superiority was over. The Hellcat had done more than level the playing field. It had tilted it so decisively that the outcome of the Pacific War was no longer in doubt. The Zero's time as the terror of the Pacific had ended, replaced by an American fighter that would dominate the skies until victory was complete.